All right, so we're back, diving deeper into this whole Illuminati and Oz media situation. It seems like every time we think things have quieted down, there's another wave of updates, mostly YouTube videos from Oz himself this time around. And man, things have been, well, complicated to say the least since that settlement. So, are you ready to jump back in with me?
Absolutely. And I think this is a really interesting example of how these online conflicts, they rarely have a clean ending, even when there's some kind of legal resolution. These updates give us this chance to sort of see the aftermath. The ripples that keep spreading, even after the initial storm has seemingly passed.
Exactly. And if you remember, we left off with Blair dropping the lawsuit and the confidentiality agreement being put in place, which basically silenced both sides. And a lot of people saw that as a win for Oz. But these new videos paint a much more, a much more complicated picture of what's been going on.
Yeah, and what I find really striking is how Oz is framing these updates. He's not coming out like boasting about a victory or anything. It's more like he's giving almost a raw, vulnerable account of what the ongoing costs of this whole ordeal have been for him personally.
Okay, so let's rewind just for a second here for anyone who might be joining us for the first time on this. Just to clarify, Oz, we're talking about Oz Media, the YouTuber who was sued by Blair, also known as Illuminati, for defamation and breach of contract. And this all stemmed from, oh my gosh, that whole chain reaction of accusations and drama that started with Blair accusing Legal Eagle of plagiarism, which, to put it mildly, absolutely exploded online.
And a really key point to remember here is that even though the judge did allow Blair's lawsuit to proceed, it doesn't necessarily mean that her claims were actually valid in the eyes of the law. It just means that they met this basic legal threshold to be able to move forward. And that brings up a really fascinating legal point that I think we should touch on.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because the judge's decision in this case, it could actually end up setting a precedent for how future online disputes are handled legally. Just think about it for a minute. What kind of evidence is going to hold up in court? When we're talking about things like defamation or breach of contract in the digital age, we're talking about screenshots, social media posts, It's really uncharted territory in a lot of ways.
No, absolutely. And Oz's situation really highlights this perfectly. Because even though he didn't ultimately have to defend himself in court, just the process of being sued, having to gather all that evidence and prepare for a potential trial, it was incredibly expensive and stressful for him.
And expensive is putting it lightly, because in one of his update videos, Oz reveals that just back when the lawsuit was getting started, it had already cost him over $40,000. And by the time mediation happened, that number had ballooned to over $80,000. And that's not even counting the expenses that were incurred by Felix, a former employee of Oz who got pulled into the lawsuit and who Oz has been supporting financially throughout this whole thing.
And I think that financial burden is such a stark reminder that even if you're on the right side of an online dispute, the legal system itself can be incredibly costly. And it really raises this big question about access to justice in the digital age. Like, what happens when individuals are faced with legal threats or actions that they just can't afford to fight, even if they believe that they are in the right nets?
Yeah, it's almost like a David and Goliath situation, but instead of slingshots and giants, we're talking about legal fees and online platforms.
And that brings us to the emotional side of things, which Oz is very open about in these updates. He doesn't shy away from discussing the toll that this whole ordeal has taken on his mental health, his relationships, and even his ability to just focus on his work.
Yeah, he talks about things like sleepless nights, anxiety, feeling constantly on edge. And there's this one detail that he reveals that is just particularly heartbreaking. He and his partner actually experienced a miscarriage during this incredibly stressful time.
Right, and that adds this whole other layer to the story, doesn't it? It reminds us that behind all of the online drama, there are real people grappling with real-life challenges and emotions, and sometimes those challenges are intensely personal and painful.
And Oz makes it clear that this personal tragedy, along with wanting to protect his partner and focus on their healing, played a really major role in his decision to ultimately accept the settlement. He wanted to be able to put this chapter behind him, to move on from the constant anxiety and the legal battles, and to be able to prioritize his own well-being and the well-being of his partner.
It's a difficult decision to make, weighing that desire for vindication against the need for peace and healing. Oz even mentions that he had a part 2 video planned, where he was ready to go even deeper into his defense and the evidence that he had gathered.
So he was prepared to keep fighting, but ultimately decided that his personal life needed to take priority over this public battle.
Exactly. And I think that in itself is a really powerful statement, Sometimes the bravest choice isn't continuing to fight, but stepping away for the sake of your own well-being and the well-being of the people that you care about.
It's a good reminder that these online conflicts, no matter how public or heated they become, They're ultimately part of our real lives, and sometimes the best course of action is to protect ourselves and those we love,
Yeah.
even if it means letting go of a fight that we might feel is important to win.
And that leads us to Oz's final update, where he actually announces the settlement itself. He keeps it pretty brief, emphasizing the confidentiality clause. That prevents both him and Blair from discussing the matter any further. He reiterates his previous warnings against sending threats or harassing anyone involved. And that's it. The video ends, and it leaves viewers with a sense of, well, I don't know. What do you think? Closure? Frustration? Something in between?
I think it's definitely an ending of sorts, but is it a satisfying one? That's what I think we need to kind of unpack next, because that confidentiality agreement might offer this clean legal break, but it also leaves a lot of unanswered questions, like what were the terms of the settlement? Does any money actually change hands? What led Blair to drop the charges so abruptly? Like, what happened there?
And perhaps most importantly, what can we, as viewers and participants in this online world, what can we learn from this whole saga?
Yeah, it's that lack of transparency that seems to be fueling a lot of the discussion online. You know, some people are looking at the settlement as like a clear victory for Oz, but others are walking away feeling like, I don't know, disappointed, or like there are too many loose ends. You know what I mean? It's like a book that just ends mid-chapter.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why these updates from Oz are so fascinating, right? Because he's kind of giving us a glimpse into what happens after that legal dust settles, that emotional and financial hangover that kind of lingers even when, the cameras are off.
Right. Think about it. We tend to focus on the big dramatic parts of a lawsuit, like the accusations and the legal maneuvering and all that. But what about the aftermath? The impact it has on the individuals involved, their careers, their relationships. These updates really bring that side of the story to the forefront. Yeah. And it's not just about dollar amounts either.
Yeah.
He talks about the emotional strain of it all, this feeling of constantly being under attack, the fear that like any little thing could spark another wave of online hate. It's a really raw and honest look at the mental toll of being caught in the center of one of these internet firestorms.
And it raises such a crucial question. How do we as a society deal with the fallout of these online conflicts, especially when they involve accusations of really serious wrongdoing, like manipulation or abuse, or even potentially illegal activities like swatting?
Oh, right. You bring up a good point. We should probably define that term for anyone listening who might not be familiar with it. Swatting, in this context, refers to making a false report to emergency services with the intent of having a SWAT team dispatched to someone's home. I mean, it's incredibly dangerous and can have devastating consequences.
Absolutely. And Oz actually claims that Blair removed swatting protections that were in place, which made him feel even more vulnerable after he spoke out against her. Now, whether or not that claim is true is something we can't definitively know because of that confidentiality agreement, but it definitely adds yet another layer of complexity to this whole situation.
Yeah, it really makes you realize just how blurred the lines can become between online disputes and real-world safety. It's not just about hurt feelings or damaged reputations anymore. It can have serious implications for people's actual physical well-being.
Right, and it also shines a light on just how challenging it can be to actually prove or disprove accusations of manipulation and abuse in an online context. Text messages can be taken out of context, screenshots can be altered, memories of events can differ. It often becomes this battle of narratives, with each side trying to present their version of the truth.
And in this case, that confidentiality agreement really throws another wrench into the mix, doesn't it? Because while it protects both parties from further legal action, it also prevents them from being able to publicly share evidence or clarify their positions on anything.
So we're left with these partial glimpses, these updates from Oz that offer us this window into his experience but can't provide the full picture. And that, I think, is what's causing so much frustration for those who are really hoping for some sort of clear-cut resolution.
It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle, but we're missing a bunch of pieces. We see the final outcome, the settlement, the dismissal of charges, but we don't have all the information to understand how we got there or what it truly means.
And I think that ambiguity is really what makes this situation so thought-provoking. It forces us to grapple with these complexities of online justice, the challenges of proving or disproving accusations in this digital age, and really the lasting impact that these conflicts can have on the individuals involved.
Yeah, and Oz's updates really serve as this powerful reminder that the internet is not some separate realm where actions have no consequences. The drama, the accusations, the legal battles, it all spills over into real life, affecting people's finances, their emotional well-being, their relationships, even their sense of safety.
It's a pretty sobering thought, and it kind of raises the question for our listeners: how do we approach these online online conflicts? Do we rush to judgment, taking sides based on limited information? Or do we step back, recognize the complexity, and try to prioritize empathy and understanding, even when it's difficult?
And on that note, I think it's time to maybe shift gears a bit and talk about the reactions to the settlement itself. Because as you mentioned earlier, the response online has been anything but uniform. Some people are looking at this as a clear win for Oz, while others are left feeling disappointed, even angry.
Yes, and I think really trying to understand those different reactions can tell us a lot about how we perceive justice and accountability in the digital age. So let's unpack some of those perspectives, shall we?
Yeah, it definitely seems like that confidentiality clause is the biggest sticking point for a lot of people. Some are looking at it as the shield that's protecting Blair from actually having to answer for all the accusations that were made against her. They wanted public reckoning, a clear verdict of right and wrong, good and bad.
It's interesting, right? There's this real human desire for a definitive resolution. We want a winner and a loser, someone to root for, someone to blame. But the truth is, online conflicts rarely fit neatly into those categories. The reality is often a lot messier, a lot more nuanced, with multiple perspectives and interpretations all swirling around.
And that's really where critical thinking becomes so important, right? As viewers, as consumers of all this information, we have to be careful not to jump to conclusions based on, just limited information or emotionally charged narratives. And I think this case is a prime example of how easy it is to get swept up in all the drama and kind of lose sight of the bigger picture.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to get sucked into that whole he said, she said vortex, but the reality is usually far more complex than that. There's the legal side to this story with very specific definitions of defamation and breach of contract, and then there's the human side with real emotions, personal struggles, and the very real consequences of online actions spilling over into people's offline lives.
Yeah, it's a lot to process, and I think that's part of what makes this whole saga so compelling. It forces us to confront these uncomfortable questions about online accountability, the power dynamics that exist between creators and their audiences, and honestly, the challenges of just navigating this digital landscape where information spreads so rapidly and the narratives are constantly evolving.
And ultimately, I think that's where the true value of these updates from Oz lies. They're not just about the legal details or the drama of the lawsuit itself. It's about the human experience of having to navigate a complex and often very painful online conflict.
He's sharing his story, not as a victor, not as a victim, but as someone who has gone through this incredibly difficult experience and wants to kind of shed light on the often hidden costs of these online battles. He's prompting us to think about the ethical implications, the emotional toll, and the need for greater empathy and understanding in the way we interact with each other online.
It's a powerful message, and I think it's one that we all need to hear, because whether we're content creators ourselves or just viewers engaging in these online discussions, we all have a role to play in shaping a more responsible and compassionate digital world.
So as this particular chapter in the Illuminati and Oz media saga seems to be coming to a close, it feels like we're left with more questions than answers, right? But I think those questions are valuable. The lawsuit might be over, but the conversations surrounding online accountability, the power of narratives, and the very real impact of these conflicts on actual people, that conversation is far from over.
And that's the key takeaway here, isn't it? These cases, these online disputes, they're not just entertainment. They're opportunities for us to learn, to grow, and to really think critically about how we engage with each other in this increasingly digital world that we all live in.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this. What do you take away from all this? What lessons resonate with you? What questions are you still grappling with? This particular case may be closed, but the conversation continues, and we encourage you to be a part of it. Thanks for joining us.